Andrea is an amazing person, former McKinsey colleague. And how many kids you got? 3, right?
3.
3 girls, right? Yeah. So she does all of that. She was an associate partner at McKinsey, one of the leaders in our people and organization practice. I had the privilege of partnering with her on a couple of different things. And then she decided to leave us because she got an awesome opportunity at Rent The Runway, where she is Chief People Officer. So we're going to explore the concept of social capital with Andrea now in the remaining time.
It is difficult to get irritated when someone leaves for a great opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like bad for us, awesome for her. I will point out that the irritation is the nonstop Facebook photos of Andrea running yet another marathon or something, and everyone there looking in crazy fit. So it's like another reminder of some people doing good things with their time, and I seem to be running to the fridge. So, are you interviewing?
Yeah, I'm gonna take a seat in the comfy chair.
I'm gonna wander off now while we do this.
Okay, all right.
All right.
All right, Brooke, I'm assuming you guys can see me. Is that correct?
We can all see you. I understand you aren't able to see us.
I am not, which is going to make this really fun, but let's go.
Okay, you have a bunch of people in the room. Everyone is so excited to hear your thoughts. You got people smiling and nodding, so it's going to be easy. All right, before we get into some of the things that you're doing at Rent The Runway, I first just wanted to ask you a little bit about how you found yourself in that role. What led you to this role, and how did you think about ultimately taking the opportunity?
Yeah, and first, let me also just make sure everybody's on the same page. So Rent The Runway is a company that basically is focused on democratizing access to fashion. So we have this closet in the cloud. So instead of purchasing designer clothes, you rent them, which is also better for the environment. And our workforce is very diverse. So we're global. We have employees in the US and Galway, as well as a corporate population that's hybrid, a warehouse population that is 100% in person, and a CX or call center population that is 100% virtual and used to be on site. So we made that switch during the pandemic. And in terms of how I came to Rent The Runway, I was at McKinsey loving it, loving life, and still hold that special place for McKinsey in my heart. But because of one of my networks, found out about an opportunity at Rent The Runway. And it's kind of a funny story. So I went to HBS. There was a Facebook group for HBS moms where we talked about our kids. And we decided we should create a Facebook group where we actually talk about job opportunities as well. And in that Facebook group, Jen Hyman, who's a fellow classmate of mine that I did not know, posted 2 lines. I need a chief people officer. Does anybody know anyone? And just given everything I knew about Rent The Runway and given the time, meaning it was in the middle of the pandemic, employee experience was really the hot topic for many organizations. I felt like the HR leaders, the people leaders really have a seat at the table. And I was excited about helping define what employee experience looks like in an organization. So I sent Jen a direct message, and now I'm here. So it was very much just kind of happened because of my networks, but I'm happy it did.
Well, we are also very happy for you, Andrea. And I love that story. So if you reflect on the role of social capital as a professional woman, I mean, that's a great story in of itself. But what has been more broadly the role of social capital as you just reflect on how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, I feel like networking has always been something that people talk about. Pre-pandemic, it was, what's your network? How do you continue to build your network, both internally and externally? I never thought of myself as someone who was really great at building social capital, but I've worked at it and I've kind of improved. I think over time, I still have more to do. What I will say, though, is the role of my network is huge, right? It obviously can continue to be more robust, but the opportunities that my sponsors and mentors helped create for me, the opportunities they helped me evaluate, the feedback they gave me while I was in those different situations has really made me who I am today. And I think it's important, especially as we start to interact more with people in person, that we think about how are we going to continue to foster our networks and rebuild the social capital that we have or already had.
Yeah, so I want to shift over to Rent the Runway, and you and I were chatting last week about some of the things that you all are doing. When you think about the categories of access, motivation, and ability, where do you see the greatest opportunity at Rent the Runway?
So I would say, first, I love those three around access, motivation, and ability. I never had words before it, before you and Bill really talked about it. And across all three, they're really important. But for Rent the Runway, I would say right now, given where we are, motivation is key. So we need to remind people the importance of social capital, remind people that an unwritten part of their job description is to connect. We've had a lot of conversations around returning to the office and what that looks like and the impact that has on productivity, quote unquote. For us, we have actually started redefining the definition of productivity. So we talk about how productivity as we return to the office will look different. We have productivity on in-office days, quote unquote, versus productivity when you're working from a virtual location should look and feel different. And we set up our OKRs to support that as well. It's interesting. We're still, I would say, in the pilot phase of it. But I think talking about it is really important, and talking about the way that the reason, like why people should be spending the time to get to know each other and not just other people in their individual teams is important.
And have you done anything, Brian Hancock, I think, is here. He talks about the office as the new off-site. Have you done anything to rethink the office in particular to try to enhance some of that redefined productivity you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I should also give a little bit of context. So at Rent the Runway, we are piloting in-office days for the entire organization on Tuesday and Wednesday. So still embracing the flexibility that we've had of working from home 3 days a week. But if you're in a location that's close to the office, we Tuesday, Wednesday are in-office days. And so what that means is those days should look and feel different. So we actually have expectations around less independent work during those times. The way our office is set up in terms of couches, happy hours oftentimes, the kitchen, just different places to convene, it really does allow for that connection. And we also at the same time are setting the expectation that Thursday afternoons in New York, Thursday mornings in Galway are the independent times. So we have like no meeting blocks. So I'd say we have an office space that definitely encourages collaboration and connection. But we're also thinking more holistically around our calendars and really providing guidance around how our days should look different when you're in the office versus when you're virtual, and trying to coordinate it so that we're all using the same structure.
And how have you, another thing we talked about was we were chatting about those differences between men and women, and Rent the Runway is a company run by women. So how did you try to specifically redefine social capital for women at the company?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because there's so much research, and you guys highlighted some of it, or a lot of it comes from McKinsey, around what women want, and where you have more females and those of diverse races that prefer to work virtually more often than others. We are more than 50% women. Our leadership team, there's 6 out of 8 of us that are women or female, and so it's definitely top of mind for us. What we're really doing is making sure that people first are very clear on why we're doing this and what the expectations are. And also know that it's a pilot where we're trying to learn from what everyone else, how this is received by everyone. And so we are very cognizant of getting feedback from our different demographic groups, not only based off of genders, and we are being really thoughtful of when we're getting feedback through our monthly all employee surveys, cutting that to see how are the things that we're implementing affecting different demographic groups in different ways. So it's still early for us, but what we have heard is that at least for the women that we have at Rent the Runway, they are excited about connecting. I think the biggest thing was when we come into the office, we want to feel like it was worth it. That I had interactions that I would not have had I stayed home. And for us, really coordinating days of when people are in the office helps ensure that you're going to run into people that you need to work with, but then also that you just want to connect with when you're on site.
And tell me, is there any story or surprise that has happened? Or, I mean, we were talking about some of the data being counterintuitive. Where did you, have an insight that got kind of challenged along the way?
Yeah, so we look at a lot of our data, especially the people who are choosing to leave Rent the Runway. What we found is that those individuals that have been at Rent the Runway for 1 to 2 years, meaning joined during the pandemic, were the most likely to attrit. And so we wanted to make sure that those newer individuals that may not have as many connections or deep connections with other Rent the Runway employees are really experiencing more opportunities to connect. And so what we've done is we've actually implemented a mentor program, which sounds pretty standard, but it's interesting because we actually hear from a lot of employees that, I'm a software engineer. I've been at Rent the Runway for I've been, a software engineer for 15 years, only been at Rent the Runway for less than 2 years. But this is the first time I've ever been in a mentorship program. And with our mentorship program, we connected individuals from different parts of the organization. So if you were on the people team, you were not going to have a mentor from the people team, but it actually allowed us to connect people from across the organization. And the feedback that we've received on that has been so positive from both the mentors and the mentees. And the mentors actually say, I've learned more about myself through this process, and I'm better because of it, which is really great to hear. And the mentees actually say, this was the best use of my time. I feel like I'm getting advice or information about not like really technical things, but things that will help me in my career as I continue to progress.
It's interesting. Last night at dinner, and I'm so sorry you're not here, Andrea, because you would have been probably at the dinner. We talked about mentorship and sponsorship, and we talked about actually one of the there are biases inherent in that too, right? We are more likely to sponsor and mentor our mini-me's, right? So how are you all using approaches? I think you mentioned using a survey, but data and analytics to try to diversify the slates of mentees, the slates of sponsorees across the company.
Yeah, so we actually, for the mentor program, sent a survey to the mentors and the mentees about what they were looking for. And we went through, and it was free response as well as, multiple choices that people had to respond to. And we went through and manually matched every individual and really did this based off of, we want to make sure that we have diverse matches. We want to make sure that we have people that have aligned areas of expertise if the mentee is looking for certain guidance. And that took a lot of time. It meant it took us longer to actually get the mentor program off the ground, but it was well worth it for sure. And I think that's something that we will continue to do. We also now are talking more actively about mentors and sponsors and what that means. And I know some organizations do that already, but I think it's important to also think about what it means in the context of returning to the office and how these interactions should be prioritized going forward.
Andrea, what kind of, there's lots of chief people officers sitting here in the room and business leaders playing other roles as well. What advice do you have for them in terms of this concept of social capital?
So first, I would say we have to treat this like all of our other priorities, right? Which means setting goals, numerical goals, finding some way to quantify this, and use the same level of rigor to say, okay, here's my goal. What's my action plan against it? Let's execute it. Let's see how close we get to whatever that goal was. And also making sure that it's the whole organization that's really rallying behind this. For us, it's one thing for the people team to create a calendar of initiatives, leadership opportunities, or leadership speaker series is one of the things that we've implemented. But everything can't be centrally organized. And so we really do have to lean in on all of our managers and leaders and encourage them to also create community. And set that as an expectation. I think one of the things that just even from this conversation, it's made me realize, we do need to start putting this in our job descriptions, because right now it's not an explicit expectation, at least in our job descriptions. Now we're talking more about it, but setting that is key. And so I would just say key thing is treat this like the other priorities. Have a goal, have a plan against it, evaluate it, and make sure that it's not just a small group of people responsible for this.
No, that's fascinating, and I wonder. We talked about gender and women specifically, but I want to go back to kind of we were looking at those level cuts. So how are you thinking about what we're calling the frontline worker too, and helping them to really grow their networks and social capital?
Yeah, so when I was going through the slides that you guys had sent, that really stood out to me as a glaring opportunity. And I think this is probably a challenge pre-pandemic, but has just been exacerbated during the pandemic. And for us, what we're really trying to do is make sure that everyone that's a frontline worker feels like they have that connection and opportunities to connect with each other and the rest of the organization. So one of the things that we're actually starting at Rent the Runway is with our ERGs, really making sure that there are real connection points between the corporate side of the ERG and frontline. And so what that looks like will be different for different groups depending on who we can get on site. But being thoughtful about that employee experience for us is definitely a priority. And I think it will really also shift the way that employees experience our warehouses.
Yeah. And Andrea, when you think about the future, so even like 3-5 years from now, what's next for Rent the Runway in terms of really transforming some of these connections that you have amongst your employees?
I mean, so what I would love to see is, and you and Bill talked about it some, about boomerangs, right? Like, how do we get more people to, after they leave Rent the Runway, they return back? And so this is all about the connections that people make, the network that they have at Rent the Runway, and then also facilitating that. So I'd love to see more boomerang employees in the next 5 years. And then I'd also love to just see a world where we have fully embraced hybrid, right? So we have not gone back to the 5 days a week, but we've somehow been able to, at the same time, foster the deep connections that we had when we were working 5 days a week in person. And so that really is the goal that we have of, we want those deep connections while also allowing the flexibility that we all appreciate, and making that a reality. It's going to mean a lot of pilots. It's going to be a lot of failed attempts, but I think at the end we'll get it right.
Awesome. I wonder if is it possible to take just a couple questions from the audience, or yeah? Anyone have a question for Andrea?
I'm curious if you all have employee resource groups and if that plays any role in how you all engage with your communities.
Yeah. Did you hear it, Andrea? Just talk a little bit more about those employee resource groups.
So yeah, we do have employee resource groups. We actually established them last year. About a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago. And they are a huge, they allow us to hear more from the employees and really understand what our different employee groups want. We give them real ownership over the agenda for the ERGs, what the activities look like, whether the activities are only for that ERG or more Rent the Runway broadly. And we also do pay the leaders of those ERGs, because we do realize that it is time, effort, and energy that goes into planning everything. And so you do get a bit of a stipend on top of your traditional salary. And for us, the ERGs have been critical. I think there's lots of opportunity for us to continue to develop them. And we'll actually be implementing new ERGs in the upcoming months. But right now we do have 4 ERGs.
Great. And maybe we'll take one more. Any other question for Andrea? Yeah, down here. Hey.
You mentioned that your expectation for productivity when in the office on Tuesday and Wednesday will be different, and that's reflected in the OKRs. Now there's a microphone. Almost suggesting that will mean, like, built into the OKRs is these will be less productive days, or that's a little bit how it came across. Will you just say how you're actually reflecting that in the OKRs?
Yeah, so, and So we have redefined the definition of productivity. So productivity, if you look at the historical definition of like checking items off your to-do list, meeting whatever numerical goals you have, that's part of it. Another part of it is actually taking the time to connect with each other and get to know one another. And what that means is you actually have less time to do the work that's for the traditional productivity. And so we had to scale back our OKRs, which actually meant, okay, if we are going to really want people to take the time to chat and get to know each other, which by the way, they were doing pre-pandemic, right? That was built in to the expectations around OKRs. Now we've just actually been much more explicit about that. And so we had to prioritize. Like we actually first came up with, the way we set our OKRs is our leadership team first comes up with the highest level priorities, and then it cascades through the organization. And we actually went through the exercise of scaling back our OKRs and saying, what is realistic given the workforce that we have today and the real expectation that we have for people to spend time connecting not just on a deliverable, but just getting to know one another, because we believe that's really important for innovation. And so we actually scaled back our OKRs. It took us longer to get to the full list of OKRs as well. And we've had explicit conversations about what we've been doing, so that we're all talking the same language and we all have the same expectation.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, so much for joining remotely despite the COVID test. Really appreciate it.